I would pose back later perhaps is that the best title even for the standard? There's a lot of internal discussion about that. There's an argument that IFRS for SMEs actually hampers adoption and understanding of what the standard is attempting to do. It really is a standard for non-accountable entities. That doesn't sound quite as nice as IFRS for SMEs, but in reality, you know, full IFRS is for accountable entities. They're the ones we should be reading, we would expect people to be engaged with and to have a big impact. IFRS for SMEs is not intended for a broad market in quite the same sense and to have quite as far a spread. I think it's important to remember also that unlike IFRS, full IFRS, that we would like to see positioned as a global standard. We believe encouraging cross-border trade and all of the good things we talk about when we talk about full IFRS. IFRS for SMEs fulfills a different role for us. It's not intended to be a global standard necessarily. The thing about IFRS for SMEs is we see it as supporting jurisdictions that are coming to IFRS perhaps from a very different tradition of accounting, or in fact perhaps from a position where they don't have a strong domestic traditional accounting paradigm. And so IFRS for SMEs is certainly, we believe, a very good standard, but it is different, and we certainly don't expect global unchanged adoption in every jurisdiction. We like to see jurisdictions that look at their own internal or accounting systems and see what they can learn from what we've done and perhaps harmonise or move towards it or adopt it, but we don't feel strongly about necessarily adoption across a wide range of organisations. We do think, though, that it's a good foundation. It's set out differently to full IFRS. We think in some ways it perhaps more eloquently summarises core concepts and ideas around some of the standards and the concepts that we're trying to get across. And we do like to think that IFRS for SMEs is a really good foundation to moving towards full IFRS. We think that by understanding IFRS for SMEs, that the broader accounting community come closer to and can far more easily understand full IFRS and engage with full IFRS. We're interested always to think about the differences between full IFRS and IFRS for SMEs, and certainly from an academic perspective, other than perhaps giving us advice on a better name that will support wider adoption. We're interested to know whether the cited differences between full IFRS and IFRS for SMEs actually do create issues. We hear different voices. We often, when it's being discussed, we hear that the differences do create problems out in the real world, and yet we struggle to find evidence that that is the case. And so we certainly would be interested in those evidence to that effect. But we think that the sort of non-accountable sector is vital. We think that IFRS for SMEs is doing a good job from the evidence that we can see in the countries where it's been adopted, and we do think that it does support a strong and profession that is able to engage with full IFRS. I guess those would be my opening points at this stage.
Thank you, Martin. You've set a great example there, and not just keeping to time, but underrunning, so that's good. Now turn to Nadia, who's Professor at ASE in Bucharest, who'll reflect on maybe some experience in Romania with SME accounting. Nadia.
Thank you first for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Indeed, we did some research on the IFRS adoption in emerging economies in the region and in Romania in special, and also we investigated the potential adoption of the IFRS for SMEs. I would like to bring two dimensions into the discussion of the decision regarding the potential adoption of the standard. So first we have the economic cost-benefit analysis. And most of the discussions around the standard, the comment letters, were built in this direction. On the other hand, there is a political angle, and based on our experience in emerging economies, this is extremely important. And even if in theory, these two should go hand in hand, there are cases when the political decision is based on other arguments. And here I will bring some examples from Romania. So after the standard was issued in 2009, a cost-benefit analysis was initiated by the academic environment, mostly based on interviews, and there was support for the adoption of the standard, but mostly under a convergence plan, so not a direct adoption. Of course, the most significant cost was triggered by the expected disconnection between accounting and taxation. This was, in fact, also the key element for expected benefits as well. Our interviews with bank analysts indicated that they will not see a benefit from the financial statements, for example, of their clients, because they can obtain additional information. However, in the case of a disconnection between accounting and taxation, they will have a better view of what is happening in various industries and at the national level. So the key issue here would be to achieve this disconnection, which is debatable, and we see that with full IFRSs. And prior research shows that listed companies claim compliance with full IFRS. However, in practice, they do a very tax-oriented implementation. So this, in fact, raises the issue of the magnitude of change actually happening in emerging economy. And here we go to the political decision, meaning that many emerging countries adopted or adopt IFRS, and they are perceived as being I don't know, a good place to do business. They make significant steps in improving their business environment. However, the big question is how significant is the change in practices, in fact, and how prepared is the local institutional infrastructure to really support the adoption. So even in the literature nowadays, we have label adopters, serious adopters, and so on. And now coming back to the case of Romania, I told you that around 2010 there was some support, including the regulator accepted that this convergence plan might work. However, in the last few years, when the European directives were transposed into the national regulations, full IFRSs were utilized as a benchmark and not the IFRS for SMEs. And this is interesting because the IFRS for SMEs would have made more sense, right? It's already simplified, it's designed for non-listed companies. But what happened is that, again, a political decision in 2012, the regulator required listed companies to use IFRS in separate financial statements as well. So the accounting information became the starting point for taxation. And in order to have comparability as a starting point for taxation at the national level, full IFRSs were followed when national regulations were designed. So what happened, in fact, was very different. And I think that another argument would be in this case the existing expertise with full IFRSs, even if there are very few differences in terms of measurement and the valuation rules between full and IFRS for SMEs, the regulator already has the experience, and their life is not easy, right? They have to deal with European directives, full IFRS, tax regulations, and bringing the IFRS for SMEs on the table would bring additional complexity and difficulties in issuing national regulations.
Thank you. Just as I was about to indicate that 7 minutes were up, Nadia stopped speaking, so thank you very much. You've set a great precedent here for Maria Dolores and for Joachim. And I hope you're already spotting that there are some great issues for discussion arising. I didn't know the Romanian story, but it's probably not the way that people would anticipate things working. But when you get in a real national environment with its politics and the practicalities of being a regulator, then things might not quite work out in the way that we'd anticipate. And also, Matt's already invited us all into a major rebranding exercise, although I have to say that non-accountable has very strange connotations for me, so maybe the game's still on to find something better. Anyway, I now turn to Maria Dolores, who will give us some experience more locally. We are in Spain, so we will learn what's happening here. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Robert, for inviting the ICAEW, the Accounting and Auditing Institute, to this symposium. Well, the ICAEW is the Spanish accounting standard setter of companies at a general level, and then I would like to provide an overview of the Spanish experience of accounting for small and medium-sized entities. Then, in the first place, I think it's necessary to define what is understood in Spain by small and medium-sized entities in accounting terms, because it's not the same that in IFRS for SMEs. They are those that comply with the requirement set out in Article 3 of Accounting Directive to be small undertakings. It means those that on their balance sheet dates do not exceed the limits of at least two of these three thresholds. Balance sheet total 4 million euros, net turnover 8 million euros, and average number of employees during the financial year of 50. Well, in Spain, around 97% of all companies are in this category. It means 1,215,000 companies, according to the Central Balance Sheet Data Office of Bank of Spain. Okay? Well, regarding Article 5 of Regulation 1606 of 2002, you know, the IFRS regulation, on a nationwide basis, individual accounts of all companies and consolidated accounts of non-listed groups are prepared in Spain according to local GAAP. Well, then, following the recommendation of the White Book of Accounting, the Spanish decision was a gradual process of reforms in accounting law. These reforms constitute then an additional step in the process of developing the Spanish accounting standards in tune with international standards, but without abandoning the Spanish model currently in force. It means that in Spain, the state has sovereignty in accounting. We use commercial code, capital companies law, and 2 royal decrees to endorse the Spanish General Accounting Plan for all companies and the Spanish General Accounting Plan for SMEs, and with a specific accounting criteria for microentities. I have to say that the definition we use for microentities is not the same that in the accounting directive. You know, the thresholds are bigger. Well, and which are the key points of these two texts? Well, these texts follow a process of convergence with the European regulation that contain IFRS, but restricting options. For example, we just use fair value for some categories of financial instruments. And we establish also models of financial statements presentations that are very useful. There are some exceptions. We use own criteria in very limited cases, and it do not imply a direct application of IFRS. And what is the Spanish General Accounting Plan for SMEs? Well, it is a complementary to the General Accounting Plan for all companies, but with the same content except for transactions not deal because they are not usual for SMEs. For example, business combination, share-based payment. And what happens in case that an SMEs can practice this transaction? If this occurs, they have to apply the General Accounting Plan for all companies, the standard contained in this plan for that transaction. Also, we have simplified criteria, for example, in terms of financial instruments, and this General Accounting Plan for SMEs must be applied in a comprehensive way. Well, another point that I'd like to treat is about the transposition of the new accounting directive. Well, as you know, the strategy in Europe is the simplification in accounting for especially SMEs. Well, we have had to modify, to amend our both plan, the General Accounting Plan and the General Accounting Plan for SMEs, to transpose the directive. And well, in terms of the General Accounting Plan, we have taken a step back on the path of convergence because it is compulsory, for example, to amortize goodwill and now all intangible assets are considered with finite useful life. Then they have to be amortized. Then we are now closer to the IFRS for SMEs, and just the opposite with the full IFRS. Regarding to political issues, we consider that it's not logical, require to the same accounting standards to all companies. We think that SMEs should have more simplifications because, well, in general, they are not audited. The thresholds in Spain for being audited are lower than in accounting terms, the definition of small and SMEs. But still, the majority of them are not submitted to audit. Then the main external user is the tax authority. Then, apart from that, other reason to keep national sovereignty about individual accounts is that commercial law, for example, also need the result from profit and loss account. For some aspects, for example, profit distribution. Then we think it's useful a close connection from accounting and this law to be useful for the SMEs. And well, that's all for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm obviously exerting quite a power over the panellists. Let's see if it continues. I do remember that you always hope that when you turn up for an examination, there's a question which you've already prepared for. And Joachim must have this feeling because he was invited by ICAEW a couple of years ago to write a paper called Is the IFRS for SMEs Working? Slightly different, but pretty much the same. And he produced a paper which will be coming out shortly in Accounting and Business Research. So I have to say it was a great paper. So let's just get a little bit of the reflections on the work that Joachim did for that paper and our conference. Joachim.
Well, thanks, Robert, for inviting me to this panel, and obviously also for saying nice words about my paper. Not sure whether they are warranted, but anyhow. Let me start with just briefly commenting on the initial question. The idea of the initial question was to get some data whether I was right or wrong when I did my own analysis. Because when I started the project for the ICAEW, I thought, well, I do some classic stuff in the sense of that I would be looking at firm level IFRS for SME reporting and understand some of the choices that these firms make, and I started to dig for IFRS for SME reports. And it took me almost half a day to find my first one, and that was the financial statements of the cricket club in Trinidad Tobago. And then I continued looking for it, and I found a set of reports, but only a very limited number. And then I tried to understand it a little bit better, and one of the key results are exactly like it's surfaced here. Firm level adoption, one-on-one adoption of IFRS for SMEs is low. We know that. And this is why I settled to do an interview kind of analysis. So I talked to leading auditing and accounting experts of 24 different countries to understand a little bit what it is about IFRS for SMEs. And one of the things that I noticed were that in the discussion to adopt IFRS for SMEs at the country level, in most jurisdictions there was relatively little direct support. So there were people, of course, proposing IFRS for SMEs, and it was debated in many jurisdictions, but only rarely somebody said, yes, we had real yes men pushing for it. In many cases, the respondents were, they remembered naysayers, people pushing against it for various reasons. And that's one thing that I noticed. Another thing which I noticed when talking about the pros and cons of using IFRS for SMEs in these jurisdictions, there were arguments which already have been mentioned, like taxation and the general cost of implementation or introducing new standards. As contra-arguments, comparability, and that's, I think, something interesting to note, was being used both as a pre and as a con argument. That makes a lot of sense when you think about it, that, of course, if private firms start to adopt IFRS for SMEs, then they become more comparable, let's say, across countries maybe, and to their public counterparts. But at the same time, if you have a sort of a stacked system where you have some private firm rules and then some IFRS rules and then IFRS for SMEs in the middle, and this is the case in many jurisdictions, then of course the firms become less comparable to some of their more national, smaller counterparts. And so this has been debated among both dimensions. When it comes to thinking about benefits and costs, so at the firm level, so what would be benefits of using IFRS for SMEs, what would be costs? I was a little bit surprised to see that there wasn't that much difference, actually. So one thing that seemed to be indicative of a contra-argument was, again, cost, right? When I'm talking about cost, I'm really talking about simple, plain, simple application costs. To just, get the people to prepare these statements. Nothing fancy, nothing like proprietary cost or whatever. And the pro-argument was transparency. So people felt that they become a little bit more transparent by using the IFRS for SMEs. Other things like, for example, taxation, debt, managerial compensation, all of them didn't really seem to matter that much. One thing that I really find interesting to note is that there's significant variation across jurisdictions. To give you quick examples here, in Serbia, for example, IFRS for SMEs has been implemented, but at the same time, firms don't really use it that much because they just stick to their old reporting format, which basically ages back to or dates back to the old socialist system. So the filing reporting system, which they still use, and to an extent that in Serbia they even changed the rules so that this becomes now again the way to account. Yeah, so they just reflect on reality, I guess. And whereas in South Africa, the one country, I'd say, IFRS for SMEs is really widely used, based on my data. In South Africa, there is a good network, an established network of accountants trained, of course, in the British tradition, yeah, and these accountants they also enforce the use of IFRS for SMEs. I think this is something that we can pick up during the discussion, whether these infrastructure is actually needed. I also would like just very briefly to touch on a more general topic with relation to IFRS for SMEs, and this is the question whether private firm financial transparency is actually an important governance dimension for countries. So what I found is that there is substantial variation in private firm financial transparency across jurisdictions. So one extreme, Sweden, the other extreme, Japan. And if you don't like Japan, think about the US also as being a country with relatively low levels of private firm financial transparency. And of course, you could assume that these countries have made wide choices, so pick the transparency regime that fits best to their overall governance structure. And one thing which I find to be relatively interesting also from a researcher's perspective is that it correlates heavily with the capital market, the organized equity capital market. The larger the organized equity capital market, the lower private firm financial transparency. Okay? And I also identified at least some cases which hits at the potential cost of opaque private firms. And I have a small example here that's from Japan. I found this very interesting, and I'm thinking about doing further work on this. So my interview partner from Japan, he told me that he really thinks that the low transparency in Japan is a big problem. And I asked him why, because we were talking about privacy being a good thing, and in Japan, obviously, this is the case. And he said, well, we have a problem with demographic change in Japan, and this is severe. And we need new people taking over old firms. But the M&A market for private firms is basically dead in Japan. And the reason is that private firms are just so intransparent. And then I said, well, they can choose to become transparent if they're looking for an M&A, to become an M&A target. And he said, well, this is not the problem. The problem is the other people can't evaluate the peers. So they don't even know. And let's picture yourself in Japan, in Tokyo, want to buy a sushi bar, and there's a sushi bar that actually gives you the accounts, but all the other sushi bars are just completely opaque. Would you invest? I will leave this to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. So congratulations to everyone on keeping pretty well to time. Maybe we'll just, before we hand over to you, maybe just give opportunity, and there's probably most opportunity to Matt, but along the line for people who've been thinking things as others have spoken, saying, I wish I'd said that, just to anticipate that or to counter it. We'll just have a few reflections down the line here, and then Joachim can think about what he thinks about the reactions, and then it'll be over to you. Okay. Matt, and you've only got a minute or two for this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Obviously, it's very difficult to construct a set of accounting standards for a broad audience that take into account tax regimes particularly. And that's always going to be an interesting and ongoing issue. And I don't think we have a good answer for that. I think it is interesting as well, this kind of signaling adoption of IFRS for emerging economies. I think it is something that we do see, and certainly, again, we think that IFRS for SMEs is a very good practice ground, and that was almost, I was reflecting on Joachim's points at the end about sort of the value of IFRS for SMEs to SMEs, and I wonder if we need to look more broadly and think about the value of IFRS for SMEs in a much broader context. Maybe it comes out that it's close to neutral for the companies themselves, but I wonder whether there are benefits more globally to the profession and to the country, and I think it would be interesting to expand the thinking just beyond the SMEs. We certainly wouldn't want to impose additional costs, but if it's neutral from their point of view, I think that we could still argue that it's useful in a broader sense. So I think there's some really interesting issues there, and certainly we're looking forward to reading more and learning more.
Nadia, anything else you'd like to say?
Just the fact that what we identified here as challenges in the IFRS and IFRS for SMEs, in particular implementation, which is the institutional context, triggers significant challenges for research as well, because we have to find the right proxies and the right models, or if we do qualitative studies, the right people with a deep understanding of the institutional context. So research is needed because SMEs represent an under-researched context, but it's not easy at all to do research, especially based on what we just discussed.
Well, you know, from my point of view, I can't talk to you about the Spanish experience because we don't follow, you know, but I think that we are very close to this standard, and we took them into account when we passed the, you know, we endorsed our general accounting plan for SMEs. Then I think that it's very useful, you know, for small and medium-sized entities that they have a special set, you know, because the objectives are completely different than from the big ones.
Thank you. And I think for me that sort of illustrates a point that we might need to think about the benefits of standards in a far broader way than we conventionally think about them for IFRS, because I sort of reflect on that experience in the UK, that having something which is a point of reference can actually bring a discipline to discussions at a national level which wouldn't be there otherwise. But it's not a kind of standard benefit of standard setting, it's just, well, why wouldn't we explain why we're doing something different? So that's maybe encourages us to think a lot more broadly about possible benefits, which probably in line with what Joachim was saying, that fascinating Japanese example. That I mean, who would have thought of that? Yeah.
Maybe one quick point, if I may, about the issue with compliance, because I really think that this is important, especially in the in emerging economies, but also in established economies, because we're talking about very small firms here, with small accounting departments, single person or just an advisor, and of course there is a lack of education, so it doesn't really mean that these people don't want to, but they simply can't. And one problem that we have here, when you think about a country which has IFRS, let's say, for the upper end of the market, and IFRS for SMEs for the, let's say, for the middle tier, and then something else for the lower tier, if IFRS from SMEs is not around, then everybody is forced to do IFRS, and this is the case in many countries. It's almost impossible for these companies to comply to IFRS. So that means IFRS becomes cheap talk then. Yeah? So sometimes it's needed to have IFRS for SMEs as in, or something simple as an easy option, so that IFRS can actually be enforced. So I think this is something that needs to be understood in combination.
Thank you. So it's your turn, nearly your turn now. I'll ask another question, because I think without congratulating ourselves too much up here, we should have identified quite a lot of interesting research possibilities around the IFRS for SMEs. So now, assuming I've got an audience which is largely a research audience, or an audience which meets and mentors and develops young researchers. Let me ask another question. Would you recommend conducting research on the IFRS for SMEs to a new researcher? Would you recommend conducting research on the IFRS for SMEs to a new researcher? And I appreciate that there's lots of issues of institutional incentives and so on behind it. You can reflect all of those, but given the range of interesting topics we've raised and the importance of this sector, who here would answer yes, that you would recommend? And by the way, when I said 10 before, that's about 10 out of 80, so you've then got a basis here. So if you want to say yes, you've got to put your hand in the air. So actually, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There seems to be about a law of 10 going on here. I think there's about 10, so let's just confirm. Here are the people who would not recommend. I'm not sure whether that actively means that you'd discourage, but you would not recommend. Just that's it. You've got to commit there. Well, it's maybe not 70 people, but it's more than put the hands up the other way. So that's an interesting bit of context for the discussion which follows, where I invite people to put their hand up, not to vote for anything, but to at least just to vote for asking a question or making a comment, and then Alfredo or Andrea will rush to you to give you a microphone. I know most people here are very famous, we should know who you are, but just in case somebody doesn't know who you are, if you could say who you are before making your point or asking a question, that would be great. So I'm now looking for hands. I see a hand.
My name is Martin Hogendoorn. What I'm now going to say is not necessarily my opinion. Maybe it's for discussion, but I hear all the people saying as positive things of IFRS SME as possible, to see the best of it. But on the other hand, can we not just admit that IFRS for SME is a failure? Would we not really, what would we miss if we would discontinue IFRS for SME? Well, we would have some countries adopting, South Africa and emerging countries. They can use the latest IFRS for SME as their local GAAP. We have in Europe the accounting directive, which is a sort of IFRS or a sort of SME accounting for all the 25, 27 European countries. And you can wonder, the ISB should focus on the things that are most useful from an ISB standard setting perspective. And is it not more useful to use the energy and the budget and the amounts on full IFRS and say, well, after, what is it, 10, 15 years, there are so few companies adopting IFRS SME, so few countries that it's, well, let's discontinue it. I would not say that necessarily that's my opinion, but I have that sort of impression.
Thank you, Martin. I don't know how passionate you sound when you are really expressing your own opinions. That sounded quite eloquent. And I have a rule here to enable the panellists to think of answers and choose what to answer. That we go for 3 questions to begin with. So I see 2 more hands. Unfortunately, it's all on Alfredo's side. So the first up there. Yep.
Very interesting topic. This is Mukesh Gargam from Monash in Australia. Now, I think there is a point made by the previous speaker about, is it a failure and should it be taken out or removed? Well, what's the need? What we do is, I think it's about users. If they're users who are going to benefit, then it should be kept. And the adoption can be voluntary. So instead of throwing away something that has been created for the purpose of SMEs, we keep it and it be voluntary. If someone wants to use it, they do it. If companies don't want to, they don't have to. So that's the point I would make. Be voluntary rather than being enforced on countries or companies based on country jurisdiction.
Thank you. And then we've got a number of hands. I can come back down here. People on this side of the room, I know there aren't as many of you, but you're going to have to try harder next time. So down here. Yep.
Kees Kampferman. I would like to add perhaps to Martin's point. I wouldn't scrap it. I would give us a hypothesis that IFRS for SMEs exists because it's good for the ISB that it exists. The ISB cannot afford not to have the standard. And that's a perfectly good reason, because if they scrapped it, they would be criticized for not doing enough for these kinds of companies. So the main way to improve it or to make it better is not so much to find the very diffuse range of possible users and try to aim at them, but get more sharply into focus what benefits it brings to the ISB standard setting program.
Thank you. So we'll stop there, but I know there's lots more questions to come. So I'll just summarise the points that were made and pass up and down the line, and people can choose which one they'd like, which point they'd like to address. So, has it been a failure? ISB should concentrate on its knitting, the stuff that it is mainly there to do. Another view that this sort of this standard should be seen purely in a sort of voluntary context, that it's about users and their wishes and the benefits to them. And then thirdly, a nice observation from somebody I might have expected to really understand the history and dynamics of the ISB case, talking about how about the problems that the ISB would face if it were not seen as interested and engaged with most of the world's businesses. So I'll look up and down the line for anyone who'd like to. I think Matt, you've probably got to pick some of those points.
So maybe I'll go last.
No, I think maybe you could go first. Actually, yes.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think there's some interesting issues there. I think it is important to. We're not an enforcing organisation. We don't enforce our standards on anyone. It's for jurisdictions to decide what they think is appropriate for their purposes. And certainly the IFRS for SMEs, they're available to any jurisdiction to adopt. I don't think that we see evidence that it's a failure. We've had a comprehensive review. We didn't expect massive worldwide adoption. That's not the criteria by which we would judge it, I would argue. I think it's true. I mean, I think there is a point that the IFRS for SMEs is important to the IFRS because we believe in the value that it offers. We are seeing increasing utilization and adoption across the world of full IFRS, and a lot of those countries that are coming on board now outside of Europe and emerging economies are showing an increasing interest in utilizing those standards. So perhaps we're in it for the long game. We're happy to see it as a slow build and hopefully support those countries who feel they're valuable. So yeah, the IFRS for SMEs I think is important to us. We certainly would be open to evidence that they're a failure if there is academic research out there to support it, but right at the moment we haven't seen that evidence.
Okay, let me invite the other panellists. Maybe there's a couple of themes to pick up. One about what would we lose if we didn't have it, and also there was reference to users, and I think in the users of these statements for the non-accountable entities. So anything you want to say about those two issues would be particularly welcome. Joachim, I think, was signaling he'd like to speak.
Well, thank you for these questions. Let me start with the following. So if you say, okay, IFRS for SME, whether this is a failure or not, and you want to have an evidence-based assessment, then obviously this is not trivial, right? Superficially, one could say, yes, it is a failure because it's not been voluntarily adopted by the by a large majority of firms. But every economist should know that it isn't, for something to be good, it's not that everybody has to use it, right? I'm a professional bike. I like bike riding. I like my bike, but a lot of people don't like bikes. So that means we cannot judge this based on the adoption rates, and I think this is not what you wanted to imply. At the same time, it's interesting to think about, well, what are the benefits of IFRS for SMEs if we neglect the idea of voluntary firm adoption? And I think here it's important to stress that this is not for every country. So the countries where I think that IFRS for SMEs might be helpful or can be helpful are countries that there are emerging countries that are on a growth pattern and that need a financial accounting regime which is scalable, in a sense that they have something they can use relatively quickly, they have something with an upward potential, and that it has some limit of comparability with, let's say, full-fledged IFRS. I think for these countries, IFRS for SMEs is actually a very good blueprint, whether they implement it as their own set with modifications, like the emerging country UK, or whether they adopt it as it is something which is obviously up to decision. What I want to stress here is that this adoption comes with significant costs in terms of education and infrastructure. And here, I to some extent share the concerns raised by the people asking questions, that maybe it's for some countries, this is still too much. It's still too complicated, it's still too, the infrastructure that they need to have such a financial accounting regime is just not there, and this is because it might not be that good. Keith, I like your idea about the IFRS for SMEs as an important input to the ISB, and that the ISB needs the IFRS for SMEs. I think there was public pressure to the ISB to do something for private firms, and they responded. And there are things that we could debate. For example, we could debate whether the ISB is the perfect standard setter for private firms, whether there could be another standard setter for private firms. And there are things that we could debate about whether there's cross-fertilization from the IFRS for SMEs towards the full IFRS. I mentioned this compliance issue, but I think what is really important to the ISB is that not every firm is forced to use the full IFRS. And in these jurisdictions which have nothing else in place, this is the outcome without IFRS for SMEs. They introduced the IFRS for everybody. And for example, Serbia in the past had this. And I think the financial statements that were a result of this were pretty far away from something that we would consider to be full IFRS. Thanks.
Thank you. Nadia.
I totally agree with what Joachim said, and in the same line, I think that the Siegel's law apply here. You probably know it. A man with one watch knows for sure what time it is. A man with two watches never knows for sure. However, the surface interpretation of this is that having full IFRS and IFRS for SMEs as potential blueprints or points of reference for emerging economies might create diversity and problems. However, if you have only one watch, you don't have a basis for comparison, so you don't see problems and you don't find solutions for improvement. So irrespective of the Romania's decision, which again was a little bit more complex, and this is why I ignore the IFRS for SMEs, I think that for emerging economies in general, it's good to have both full IFRSs and the IFRS for SMEs as potential points of reference. It's more job to do for the national regulators, but it's good to have both of them and compare them.
Thank you. Maria.
Thank you. Well, I think that IFRS for SMEs are very useful, especially in countries, that need this resource because they need a higher discipline in accounting terms. But perhaps one problem would be the wide definition, from the IFRS for SMEs, Then, because it's in the same package, such a high, number of, companies could be a little difficult to manage. For example, in our case, some issue that is very appreciated for our SMEs is that, in Spain, we have a body to give a solution to the concerns they can have to interpret the standards. Then this issue should be solved, I think, also from the ISB, maybe, to be more useful.
Thank you. So we have another round of 3 questions. I hope we have one over here. So we'll definitely take... Oh, Andrea, you've left your customers here. We've got one over here.
Yes, hello. Irene Karamano. I'm from the University of Cyprus. And because you began the session asking this question, whether we would recommend to someone to do research in SMEs and accounting standards for SMEs, I was trying to think about the research questions that could come up. And what I have noticed here is that we mostly focused on the costs of the application, but we haven't really specified the potential benefits. And again, as an academic, I'm thinking of a lot of potential benefits that could arise. Some of them are clear, some are less clear. For example, you also mentioned something about the banks, that if they need the information, they will get it anyway in other ways by contacting or asking the specific information from the companies themselves. So maybe that's a potential benefit, right? We have a user group right there who would actually want to see statements, right, under a regime that they trust. Would we need them for better corporate governance, right? I mean, even for private companies, we have smaller and larger investors, shareholders. Would this information be useful to the smaller shareholders? You also talked about comparability. And this is what I am not really sure, how we would actually measure comparability and why comparability would actually affect or be a benefit, given that the financial statements are not publicly available for most of these firms, right? So how do we measure comparability? Thank you.
Thank you. I think there were a few questions in there, but we won't count this as 3. We'll have 3 people, so I think you choose out of the 3 hands which 2 you want to choose this time.
Thank you. My name is Gavin Reid. I'm head of the Dundee Business School at Aberdeen University and Professor of Economics and Finance at Aberdeen at St Andrews University. The point I wanted to pick up was Joachim's point on scalability, and to think not so much is this a failure, but is this form of reporting relevant to a particular firm type, and might we want to encourage that kind of firm type? Now, just as a matter of pre-announcement, I am speaking on this topic at 9 a.m. on Friday. I hope people will be up after breakfast for that. And it's something I've done research on for a number of years, including recommending PhD students that they might work on it. So that one on Friday is, in fact, looking at the Taiwanese case and their recent experience of fully exploring whether to go in this direction. They didn't do that, but it did modify their existing regime. They came up with an alternative standard, and that was something that the panel has spoken about. So my take on it, following up on Joachim's, is, yeah, scalability is important. If the type of firm you're looking at is one that really wants to have a regular rotating, sustainable business that's not likely to grow, perfectly valid thing. It's a sustainable business that gives employment over a long period of time. Nothing wrong with that, but it hasn't got growth potential, then this standard for SMEs may not be relevant. If, however, it's a growth firm, especially if it's a high-tech growth firm, if it's a firm that may want to IPO and have ambitions to do that, then I think it's a different kettle of fish. There may not be a lot of them, like not everybody cycling, but they're the kind of firms that I think in emerging economies you do want an encouragement in terms of giving them a format that is upwardly compatible with where they want to go, given their ambitions.
Thank you. And who would you like to give the microphone to next? Oh, yes, it could be Anne.
Thank you. Anne Jorissen, University of Antwerp. A lot of countries adopted IFRS for SMEs because they received grants from the World Bank or the IMF. The reason why World Bank and IMF wanted these countries also to adopt IFRS for SMEs and also full IFRS for the listed firms was to increase the governance of these companies, increase transparency and information. And my question is there any evidence or any study at the moment that after these countries have applied or adopted IFRS for SMEs, that foreign direct investment in these companies has increased? And if so, this could be seen as a beneficial effect of adopting IFRS for SMEs. With respect to Joachim's element of infrastructure being there, I was thinking in some emerging countries, business is on a relationship basis and not on formal contracting, and maybe even if you have IFRS for SMEs in these countries, but still all the transactions are based on relationships, they don't trust the accounting numbers, and maybe a whole cultural or a whole transition has to be made from relationship-based economy towards contracting-based economy before IFRS really can become accepted in those countries.
Thank you. So, it's a fantastic range of issues raised in those questions that I'll try and summarise, and then I'll look for volunteers to go first. So, we had some enthusiasm from Cyprus about encouraging people to do research, but in particular to think of benefits, not just costs, and asking questions about whether for smaller shareholders these IFRS statements, IFRS for SME statements are useful, and how important comparability is and how we measure it. From Gavin, I think he mentioned something that was happening on Friday at 9 o'clock, but I'll not add to the advertising for Friday at 9 o'clock and Gavin. But I think he talked about encouraging people to do research, but picking up on that's probably a really nice point about what sort of companies amongst this huge population of SME companies actually are suited to the IFRS for SMEs, and is it helpful to them? And it's within that diversity of the SME sector. Are we really helping those who are maybe great growth startups who might be graduating to the full markets, or does it work for stable, probably lifestyle businesses? So that seems to have lots of research possibilities within it. And then finally from Anne, an observation which is very closely tied to ICAEW's own experience in doing work in developing capacity building in countries supported by the World Bank or the IMF, that it tends to come with a prescription for IFRS or IFRS for SMEs, and that there's probably some researchable questions there about whether you can find the benefit of those accounting changes, or can you see evidence of the other parts of the infrastructure coming in place. So I think in all those questions we've got plenty of potential research topics. So I'll look up and down the line for whoever doesn't avert their gaze quickest to see whether... Oh, Joachim was not averting his gaze, he was smiling at me, so there you go.
I can take the first shot. So, thanks for the questions. I really like the idea to look more into the potential benefits, and I think it's important in that regard to separate benefits at the individual firm level, so from an individual firm perspective, and from potential network benefits. So network benefits that arise because a group of firms is using this, right? So these things like the M&A market I mentioned. For the individual firms, it doesn't seem to be that super large currently, given that the evidence we have in terms of adoption. But I have one example that I would like to make, and that was from, if I remember correctly, from Argentina, where the respondent told me that some firms in Argentina that happened to be seeking finance, that they switched to IFRS for SMEs because they need private financiers or private financing from Brazil. In Brazil, IFRS is more common than in Argentina, and this is why they switched to IFRS for SMEs in order to communicate more efficiently. So obviously potential questions here evolve around whether there is some IFRS adoption effect with a spatial component, so that, say, people in countries or firms in countries close to IFRS land are more likely when they need financing to adopt IFRS for SMEs. I like this scalability story. I have to confess that I'm leaving Friday morning, but I like the scalability topic myself, and I think it's really interesting to think about this. Here I also have an example from my interviews. In the Ukraine, IFRS seems to be relatively popular, also with relatively small firms, and as the reason why these firms like to follow IFRS, there were made two arguments. One was, well, yeah, again, compliance enforcement is not so tough, so it's not so costly to adopt IFRS, label adopt IFRS maybe. And the other was, well, everybody wants to grow. Yeah, everybody wants to be bigger. And this is why they felt that if they would do something which wouldn't be IFRS, then everybody would say, you don't want to grow, and then this looks just small and boring. By the way, we also had a debate about whether the name IFRS for SMEs, small and mid-sized, might be a problem in some of these jurisdictions, because it then looks like, well, you do an IFRS slide, that's uncool. And this is something which might be worth looking into a little bit more. And your questions about the World Bank's policies and effects on FDI and relationship-based versus contracting-based, let's say, firm procedures, both very interesting. So I thought about the World Bank FDI stuff at some point in time. And here I'm playing the endogeneity police again. So it will be inherently hard to separate the effect of IFRS from SMEs here, because whenever the World Bank steps in and we're financing, of course, it's a bunch of stuff that they do. But maybe one explores the institutional setting in more detail, and one can come up with some sort of variation that would be interesting. From a descriptive standpoint, I think this is one of the nice questions if people are interested in emerging economies and the role of transparency in emerging economies, and I think we should. It's really an important topic, perfect link to development economics. Yeah, you can do something good for a change. So relationship-based versus contracting, that's something, a topic I find absolutely fascinating, also from a development economics perspective. And in development economics, this relationship-based management is normally seen as sort of a friction to growth. Yeah, so you can have relationship-based business models. They work perfectly fine and they're relatively stable, but they don't scale. So they scale to a certain amount, but then normally they flip into bribery-based business models, and that's relatively inefficient. In most countries, not in everyone, I guess. So it would be fascinating to think about this a little bit more, especially with regards to a change in business models when you think about online business and the ability to scale good business ideas relatively quickly. Then obviously it's fascinating to think about whether this relationship-based type of communication is a friction, and whether, let's say, standardized accounting could be a way to mitigate these frictions. So interesting stuff.
Thank you, Joachim. And we've got another contender for Matt's rebranding. It's called IFRS Cool. That would be good. And I've now learnt a new phrase about the endogeneity police, but I mean, actually that point about the impact of the IFRS for SMEs is no different from the impact of IFRS, which, for example, in Europe went along with a whole range of other institutional changes, so it's quite hard to isolate the effect, and maybe we should think that it's kind of part of a movement where you need to change a lot of things at the same time, rather than saying that it works in isolation. So, sorry, I'm not a panellist, I shouldn't be commenting, but there are interesting points being raised. I look up and down the line for anyone who'd like to pick up anything that Joachim didn't cover. Oh, yes, hands going up everywhere. So, Nadia.
Just to continue the discussion, I totally agree that it's quite difficult to isolate the impact of adopting IFRS in order to have benefits. We recently conducted a study based on a survey in the region and found that currently the benefits flowing from the IFRS adoption are mostly perceived to be at a company level, and benefits, let's see, at a larger country level, such as economic development, improvements in the capital market, foreign direct investment, are still expected to flow. On the other hand, also in line with what was mentioned, serious versus label adopters. If companies are not ready to support the cost of a proper implementation, they will not see benefits, and also this will hinder seeing benefits at the national level. And finally, some insights from some interviews we recently did with experts from the World Bank. They said that when they started the work with emerging economies, they thought that, okay, it will be difficult, but in 3-5 years, things will change and everything will go very well. But now they realized that a much longer period of time is needed, and now they see it as about 30 to 40 years to see a real change in emerging economies.
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, just to pick up on a couple of things. I think, one, the name, which I've already mentioned, you're absolutely right. Some of the feedback we get from South Africa is from some very large privately held firms who are quite insulted to have to apply IFRS for SMEs when they're neither S nor M. The other one, I think maybe there is going to be some opportunities. I was listening to our middle commenter, and I think that we're going to see, and we've seen announcements quite recently of a number of emerging economies that are adopting full IFRS, and they have quite shallow capital markets, very few listed firms, but obviously the intention is to grow, and I think that's an interesting point to pick up, and I wonder whether there is an opportunity to look at jurisdictions that also adopt IFRS for SMEs and look at actually that transition to listing and whether there's differences in the experience and capital markets between listing of entities that have come from an IFRS from SMEs background and those that haven't. So it could be quite interesting to look at a time-based kind of study.
I think Maria's agreed to forfeit a slot now because that will allow us to have some time for a final round of 3 questions before we must wrap up. So still a bit underweight on this side, but I'm looking for 3 more hands. Oh, we've got one there. Excellent. You're not quite engaged with the microphone. Can you sprint around with a working microphone, or the microphone's not? Oh, that sounds great, yes.
My name is Loliwe, and I'm from South Africa.
Oh, yes.
Yes. There are some few good issues which have been highlighted. On the introduction, they mentioned issue about the lack of data, and also the issue about transparency, willingness of companies excuse me, to participate on the research, mostly the small companies. Now, what I would like to know is this. when one is doing research in relation to the IFRS for SMEs, what is an appropriate sample? The example was made about Spain, that 97% of the companies are private or unlisted companies. Now, what will be the appropriate sample in order for one to have strong results or to have significant impact, whatever findings he will find in his research? What I have noted, I have read the paper, NIDEA's paper. They sampled 24 companies. It was maybe 5 in each company. And Joachim is talking about 24 unlisted companies. Is that, those few examples, is that a representative sample in order to gauge whether is there a good feedback in terms of IFRS for SME?
Okay, thank you. And 2 more questions. Thank you.
Yes, all right. Thank you. My name is Paul Andre from HEC Lausanne. I would argue that there might be a set of firms that would like to use IFRS for SMEs, and that might be actually listed SMEs. So what does the panel think about maybe just giving firms a choice? We do see on the other side that when we did give the choice in some countries to unlisted firms, some do choose voluntarily to adopt full IFRS. So in that sense, and we know that that's probably one of the most critical groups to sometimes IFRS, would that not be an option? So an open question.
Thank you. And the final question. Thank you. Just there.
Sue Wright, University of Newcastle, Australia. I'm interested in the panel's views on where the thresholds should apply. Should that be something that is dictated by the IASB, suggested, recommended? Should that be something that's determined by each country, depending on the makeup of industry, size of the economy, and anything else you can think of? Thank you.
Thank you. So there's probably first question about Joachim's sampling, which we'll try and do quite quickly, but also I think more generally the question of getting valid research results from, given the difficulties of gathering data. We've got a challenge from Paul there about should we allow listed SMEs to apply this? Should we give more choice? And an invitation finally from Newcastle, Australia, about whether people have views on the thresholds for applying this standard, and should the ISB get more involved in those threshold issues. So, Joachim first, and then we'll have contribution from everyone else before it's time to sign off.
Okay, thanks for the question. So first with regard to the sample, maybe a clarification thing, because my sample is not companies, but countries. So, and I take just, the thing that I do, I just talk to one person per country. So, and the general idea of this is less that of a typical statistical analysis, but more of collecting knowledge. Yeah, so it's really explorative. So it's a little bit different from a typical cause and effect study, right? Now, the interesting question is, how large should a sample be in order to do something useful on private firms? Given, yeah, for example, that you're based in South Africa, I think the questions that we just discussed about relationship-based business models versus contracting-based or arm's-length business models, and the question whether changes in accounting have an effect on this, yeah, these are very relevant questions, at least to me. And if somebody could provide evidence on this, I think the only rules that would apply to such a sample is that the general limit theorem applies, right? So if you have the best possible sample to answer this research question, and it happens to be a small sample because data availability issues and whatnot, so be it. I don't think that the sample size per se, but this is, you know, people have different opinions on this, but personally I don't think that the sample size per se is a quality aspect of a study. The sample should be the best available sample to answer the research question at hand. And if the sample is small, where's the problem? In life science, people do studies on 18 subjects without any problem. So the next thing that I want to mention is Paul.
And we are running out of time, so...
Sorry.
Okay, I'll just go up the... on Maria, anything you'd like to say in conclusion?
Well, you know, from our experience, we converge. We think we converge. Then, from our experience, IFRS for SMEs are a good, you know, are useful, and it's a good discipline for countries, for jurisdictions, you know, to have something like that, especially if they don't have anything similar or something like that.
Thank you. Nadia.
Very difficult questions, having the standard as an option and the thresholds to be used or the criteria to be used. In my opinion, the option should work very well in a context in which companies don't have an accounting starting point for taxation, because if accounting is a starting point for taxation, the regulator would prefer to have a similar starting point, and therefore the choice is not working. Otherwise, the standard would be a third requirement, right? Tax, accounting, and after that the standard. Regarding the threshold, ideally, I think that the ISB's definition is the best criterion. However, in practice, the size is easier to be enforced, and the size should depend on the economy, because statistically developed countries have larger SMEs in size than emerging economies.
Thank you. And Matt, final comments. You might want to talk about that, those threshold issues and the optionality.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think it's interesting. If you have a look at at the ISB's website, it actually explicitly precludes the use of IFRS for SMEs for entities that have public accountability, and I think it would be potentially quite unfair to sort of use it in that context when it's explicitly written not for that context, and reputation issues and concerns could arise about the standards that placed unfair expectations on them. So we have been approached, and there have been discussions about IFRS for SMEs plus or IFRS minus. I think from my own perspective, the concern is, where do you stop? Do we have IFRS for entities that are raising funds through something like Kickstarter? Do you have IFRS for different kinds of entities? You begin to get a very fractured approach. As for thresholds, I think the view would be that this is very dependent on jurisdictions and go far beyond issues of size and necessarily and economy, and are too difficult, I think, for the they're better dealt with within specific jurisdictions.
Right, thank you. So it's now time to wrap up. Let's just ask you to show your hands for a final question. Is the IFRS for SMEs good for SMEs? Those who say yes, put your hands up now. Is the IFRS for SMEs good for SMEs? There's something strange here. There's a rule of 10, which means that the first option of yes seems to get about 10, and so we won't have people saying that it's not good. So that I'll take that as a good temperature check at the end. It's now time to thank you all for your questions. You lived up to expectations. We could have carried on, but you used up half the time with some very good challenges, which took us into very interesting places. I should also thank the panellists, and I should also thank Alison Dunjerovic of ICAEW, sat at the front here, who helped put together the panel organising things. We'll be no doubt producing a whole stream of social media and blogging activity on the wisdom that you've all shared with us today. I hope that you'll visit ICAEW booth and stand, whatever we call it, and also look out for some of our material that's already been out there about SME accounting requirements, how you might go about basing policy on evidence. So we have that paper, and we've got the forthcoming issue of Accounting and Business Research, where you can not only read Joachim's excellent paper, but some others from last year's Information for Better Markets conference. And I'd sort of make the same conclusion here that I made at that conference, which is that in our discussion of private companies and SMEs, we've actually touched upon a huge range of issues relevant to financial reporting, but we've dealt with a huge range of issues, and I just sort of offer the thought that what we're dealing with is the general case of what's relevant in thinking about accounting research and its interaction with institutions and different sorts of businesses and the economy. And maybe when we focus on that special case of companies that have announcements and share price movements every day, maybe we get into a specific case and don't look at the more challenging general economic issues. So my challenge would be that everybody should really be doing research on these issues, and maybe there's some small specialist group that might think that it's interesting enough just to look at data sets for share price movements and public company announcements. So that's my challenge. Everyone should do this, because we're talking here about what our profession is about. So with that challenge, you don't have to applaud me if you don't want, but you can applaud anyone else like yourself for your excellent questions, the panellists for their great contributions, and Alison for putting it all together. You may go now. Thank you.